Welcome to the debate. Today we are diving deep into what's being widely reported as a fundamental crisis for the Toronto Maple Leafs. The situation, and Elliotte Friedman suggests this pretty strongly, is heading toward very uncomfortable decisions after what's really been a disastrous season. The source material paints a damning picture. Poor advanced analytics. The coach, Craig Berube, is critically on the hot seat, and maybe most strikingly, the end of their 13-year sellout streak because of just palpable fan apathy.
And that apathy really brings us to the core question. Where does the responsibility for this whole organizational and performance collapse primarily lie? I mean, is it with the core group of players who have consistently failed to execute on the ice? Or does it rest with the management and the organizational structure? The GM, the coaching, MLSE itself, that has fostered this entire environment?
I'm going to argue that the failure rests squarely on the lack of commitment and, frankly, the lack of accountability from that established player core. They are the highly paid agents of this collapse.
And I'll present the case that this crisis, which is marked by some pretty severe financial consequences and systemic weaknesses that are confirmed by the data, is fundamentally rooted in organizational and management misdirection. This is, at its core, a failure of construction and strategy from the top down.
I see why you emphasize the organizational symptoms. I do. But let me give you a different perspective, one that's really rooted in behavioral evidence. We have watched this core group of high-salaried players cycle through coach after coach after coach. The reports indicate they have heard the same message delivered in 3 different ways over several years, and yet this group still doesn't get it. The systemic issue here isn't the instruction, it's the refusal to adhere to it. The evidence is pretty clear that the team's prescribed structure, specifically its system, the dump and chase or a similar forechecking pressure approach, it's valid. It's proven to work at the highest levels of the NHL. We can just point to recent Stanley Cup successes like the Florida Panthers as a clear model of this structure's efficacy. But when the Leafs try it, they fail. Not because the system is flawed, but because of massive execution gaps. They're dumping the puck and then immediately peeling off for a change. There's just no commitment to the foundational structure. So firing the coach and bringing in another new voice is, it's an exercise in futility if the players refuse to execute the plan. The writing is on the wall, and the consequences stem directly from star players like Austin Matthews and William Nylander, reportedly giving only 20% effort on critical parts of the game. The best blueprint in the world can't succeed if the personnel refuse to lay the foundation.
That is a compelling argument, and it focuses on the, let's call it, behavioral resistance of the players. But I come at it from a different angle. We have to acknowledge the scale of this crisis, which is, I think, far larger than just a motivational dip in the locker room. This is not just a performance issue, it's a financial crisis. It's marked by growing fan apathy and declining ticket sales. And the last time the organization saw this scale of financial rejection was back in 2014-15, which, as we know, ultimately forced MLSE to pull the plug and commit to a full, painful rebuild. This decline is fundamentally a failure of the organization to deliver a valuable product. The reports are not subtle about this. The product on the ice is considered boring and, sucks. And that's why fans are abandoning the team. And crucially, not willing to pay the exorbitant price. The reports state plainly that tickets and concession costs are excessive, and MLSE's internal excuses, trying to deflect blame by citing a home-heavy early schedule or the Blue Jays' long season, that's just organizational spin. The very fact that they need to manufacture excuses confirms they recognize the failure is systemic. This decline is solid evidence that the team was poorly constructed from the outset, a failure that rests squarely with the general manager, Brad Treliving. So when Freeman confirms the season is one with consequences, it demands that management changes start at the very top to clean house, particularly since a new strategic direction requires a GM to appoint his own head coach. Apathy is the critical financial sign that the system itself is broken.
Okay, so let's focus on that fan response then, that financial indicator. How can you claim this is solely a player accountability issue when the management structure itself is contributing to the apathy by delivering a poor product and, coupling it with these excessively priced tickets? The fans are astute. They're not satisfied by narrow overtime losses because they see the larger structural failure. The team is consistently outside the playoff window or just barely hanging on. It's that lack of structural success combined with the premium price point that generates the apathy, isn't it?
I understand the gravity of losing the sellout streak. I mean, that is a significant indictment of the brand's immediate value. However, that apathy is the direct emotional result of watching highly paid stars fail to deliver consistent, professional effort. The fan base knows the potential of this roster, which makes the inconsistency from minimal effort so much more frustrating than, say, a team that just isn't talented enough to begin with. I mean, consider the analysis of that horrible Tuesday game recently, where the team somehow pulled out a win despite being vastly outplayed. The reaction the next morning wasn't excitement about getting the points, it was confusion. It was the realization that the team got away with that. And that feeling of getting away with it is, I think, psychologically worse for fan engagement than a predictable loss, because it indicates a total lack of control and professional execution. The team's inconsistency, that failure to adhere to structure, is what drives fans away far more than the price of a beer. If the players executed the system effectively, they'd win consistently, and historically, cost becomes secondary when the product is championship caliber. The players' on-ice resistance is the primary driver of the boredom that you're citing.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the data points to structural flaws that predate this recent dip in visible effort. And let me tell you why. The underlying analytics, specifically the bad advanced analytics cited in the reports, they strongly suggest the problem is systemic structure, not just random dips in player motivation. When we talk about poor advanced analytics, we're talking about metrics like Corsi for percentage falling dramatically, and maybe most critically, those high expected goals against numbers. These metrics confirm that the system is allowing way too many high-danger chances, and it's failing to sustain possession or pressure.
Okay, the reports confirmed that last year's performance was masked by historically good goaltending and some clutch defense, indicating that the construction was fundamentally flawed long before player effort dropped this season. A structure built on masking severe defensive deficiencies with, excellent luck or unsustainable goaltending is a structural failure designed by management. And while players absolutely must execute, they are operating within a poorly designed framework. This confirms that the management team, Brad Treliving, is responsible for building a foundation that was just too brittle to sustain itself once the luck ran out.
That is a powerful metric. The high expected goals against is undeniable evidence of a system breakdown, but the core tension remains. Is that breakdown due to inherent poor design or the deliberate non-compliance of the most important employees? The system itself isn't entirely foreign. It involves a structured forecheck and pressure. Player failure to execute that forecheck consistently forces the defense into those high-danger scenarios you just cited. When players are dumping and not chasing, they immediately relinquish possession. That guarantees the next action is a dangerous rush against their own net. That is a tactical failure driven purely by effort and commitment. Furthermore, let's look at the operational reality the organization is facing right now, which heavily constrains management's ability to affect change. The team is, for lack of a better word, stuck. High-value players like Morgan Riley and others have no movement clauses. These NMCs prevent the general manager from making the necessary roster changes to inject urgency or shake up a toxic environment. If the reports are accurate that the players are now forcing their way into getting a new coach through non-compliance, it just proves the toxicity of the player core is the overriding issue. That dynamic makes any coaching changes entirely pointless. It's an unsustainable power dynamic where the employees dictate the terms of management through non-execution, regardless of any structural flaws they may have inherited.
I acknowledge the constraint of those no-movement clauses. They certainly limit the agility of the GM. I get that. However, if the team is headed towards some very uncomfortable decisions, as the reports say, those consequences have to start at the top, regardless of who has an NMC. The inability of management to extract professional effort and adherence to a structure from their highest paid, high NMC assets is the very definition of a management failure. If the core problem is a lack of buy-in, it suggests the current leadership, Craig Berube, is failing to manage a team that urgently needs a new message and a cultural overhaul. Berube is clearly failing the crucial task of leadership effectiveness. Moreover, the argument that Tree Living built a poorly constructed team, which you seem to concede with the masked analytics point, suggests the fundamental structural weakness originates above the coach's pay grade. So, removing both the GM and the coach is the only clear signal that the organization recognizes the systemic depth of this crisis and is willing to accept accountability for those design flaws. The players must be held accountable, yes, but who is accountable for assembling and managing a group that's structurally designed to fail when it's not receiving world-class goaltending? That falls to the GM.
I concede that the GM, by granting those NMCs and assembling a group that's prone to requiring that kind of masking, put the organization in a very precarious structural position. That is a fundamental managerial error. But even if we clean house, if Tree Living and Berube are removed tomorrow, the organizational position remains extremely tenuous. Because a failure to move off the players means the new management team will face the exact same systemic refusal to adhere to structure, regardless of who is behind the bench. That is the crucial, painful point. We're discussing the primary source of the organizational rot, and that source is the established culture within the locker room that believes it is above the tactical system, that it can choose when and how to execute. The players are leveraging managerial mistakes, the NMCs, to actively avoid their own professional duties. Until that cultural rot is addressed by moving the core players, any change at the management or coaching level is just rotational maintenance. It's not a solution. The failure to chase after the dump is purely a player choice and an accountability issue.
But the problem with that cultural rot argument is that it seems to absolve the organizational structure of its responsibility to change that culture. Culture is driven by expectations and consequences set by leadership. When the team fails systemically, as shown by the high expected goals against, it suggests that management has failed to enforce a system that demands professional commitment. The financial consequences and the fan apathy just confirm that this failure is recognized externally as an institutional one. We can't ask the fans to tolerate exorbitant ticket prices because the highly paid staff decided to slack off. The organizational structure sets the price and the strategy, and both are at this moment indefensible.
In closing, while organizational and managerial decisions certainly created the precarious environment for this crisis, the current depth of failure and the immediate inability to fix it is fundamentally defined by the players' consistent failure to execute the system and show commitment. The evidence of player noncompliance, for me, outweighs the structural weaknesses they inherited. The writing is on the wall. Structural changes to the core roster, however difficult that may be due to MMCs, are the only viable path forward to restore integrity and performance. A new coach will not fix a defiant locker room.
And I'll reiterate that the organization's current trajectory, defined by managerial excuses, strategic construction flaws evidenced by poor analytics, and the profound loss of fan engagement and ticket sales, requires accountability from management. Both Berube and Tree Living need to be held accountable to reset the strategic direction. The organizational structure has allowed this team to become fundamentally flawed and, yes, culturally toxic. The solution must begin with the people who are responsible for the blueprint and the budget.
What is undeniable, and I think we both agree on this, is that the source material clearly indicates the Maple Leafs are at a critical juncture where major consequences are looming. The organization now has to decide whether the primary target for those uncomfortable decisions should be the locker room or the front office, leaving everyone else to weigh which systemic failure is truly the root cause.